And Jesus is talking in parables. And let's look at what he says. And he began to speak unto them by parables. A certain man planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it. A hedge, a wall. A wall. Yes, President Trump, there's a wall in the Bible. Yeah. A certain man planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it and digged a place for the wine fat and built a tower and let it out to husbandmen and went into a far country. Immediately a hedge about it. That means that this is an area of sovereignty, an area of sovereignty. And at the season he sent to the husbandman a servant that he might receive from the husbandman of the fruit of the vineyard. Yeah. And they caught him and beat him and sent him away empty. And again he sent unto them another servant, and at him they cast stones and wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully handled. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Having yet therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. But those husbandmen said among themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. Dun, 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 dun. And they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. What shall therefore the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandman and will give the vineyard unto others. And have ye not read this scripture, that the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So that was the parable that Jesus gave at that time. It's pretty, I think it was pretty obvious to the scribes and Pharisees who were listening to this that when he talked about servants, he was talking about the prophets that God sent, in which the Jewish people manhandled and sometimes killed. And finally God sent his son, his only begotten son, was Jesus. But then the husbandman, that is the clergy, said to themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. Wow. Verse 7 that I just read is certainly resonates a great deal with us, doesn't it? That Father appointed his heir to the vineyard, but the clergy, the leaders, especially of the Korean church, the leaders of the American church are basically just, they're servants of servants. They don't even speak Korean. They have no idea what's going on in Korea. People like Tom Walsh, who was on the Supreme Council, may think that he understands what's going on. He doesn't have a clue. And he can't have a clue because he's not in the sort of the off-stage discussions that are going on, where decisions are actually being made. Anyway, so the Korean leaders in the Cheonjeonggung and other places, were plotting, apparently centering on Kim Sok-byung, who declared in public that he did not join the Church of Reverend Sung Myung-moon. He joined the Church of Hak Ja-han. When he joined, he did not join because of a true father. He joined because he considered himself always from the beginning to be a follower of Hak Ja-han. And as the sort of the head of in the Communist Party we would call it the Propaganda Bureau, as the head of the eyepiece TV, head of all the sort of the media or the church official media, the photography and this kind of thing, he was in a powerful position. He was in a position where he had daily access to True Father and to Hak Ja-han. And he used that access to gain the confidence of Hak Ja-han, and especially in the what was kind of crucial, I think, to his climb to power was the helicopter accident, where everyone was focused on getting father out of the helicopter as quickly as possible, and then up the hill, away from the helicopter as it was burning. But Kim Sok-byung focused on Hak Ja-han, and he carried her on his back. And so apparently she credits him with saving her life, or anyway, apparently she thinks that way. And so, especially from that time on, he became a very powerful figure among those who were plotting to take over the church and take over Father's foundation as soon as he would pass. And so they started, even before Father's passing, started to look at ways where they could change Father's words and take over the blessing and so forth. And I remember now, sometimes you think back and you realize that something that someone said that sort of struck you as a little bit strange, but you didn't really pursue it at that time. But now you think back and realize that, yeah, that's what he was talking about. So I remember in August of 2012, I guess late August or something like that, second half of August, there was a point where, Father, by the solar calendar, passed on September 3rd. But in sometime in later part of August, 2012, it became clear to Kukjinim and to Hyungjinim that plans needed to be initiated for a funeral service, a songhwa service for a true father. And there was a moment where, of course, as father's son, Kukjinim wanted to, and as the head of the Tongil Foundation, Kukjinim wanted to make sure that he and the second king were the center of these plans. Whereas in Cheongpyeong, there was another group, another force center, as you might say, power center, because Cheongpyeong never allowed itself to be placed under Kukjinim or the Tongil Foundation or the church. So Cheongpyeong at that time was another separate independent power center. And there was some possibility that they might claim the right to prepare the funeral. But then it was reported at one point that that Han Mother said something like, "Well, let's see how well the Tongil Foundation and the church are able to prepare. Let's see how well they're able to do. Let's sort of let them go ahead and prepare." And the Han Mother was sort of reserving the right to see what preparations were made, and then at the last minute, perhaps cancel those and go to whatever the Cheongpyeong Power Center might have prepared. Anyway, that was reported to Kukjinim, that Mother had said this. But now I think back and I realize that basically what the Cheongpyeong Power Center and Kim Song-pyong had decided to do was to go ahead and let Kukjinim and the second king go ahead and let them do all the funeral planning while they pursued their plot for a coup d'etat. They were too busy, to plan a funeral, because they were planning a coup d'etat. And they were not just planning; they had already planned it. They were executing a coup d'etat, and they were rounding up their forces to take over. And so, even before the funeral, there was a meeting where, in the Cheonjeonggung, which I attended, where the Han Mother announced that God would no longer be called God, but would be called by this name that that Family Federation is using now, which I will not repeat here. And that was sort of the first salvo of the coup d'état, as you might say, the first firing of that coup d'état against father and against his heir. And I would say the next one would be the meeting that took place, I guess, maybe it was the same meeting, maybe it was after, I'm not exactly sure, where the Han Mother, again in the same room in Cheonjeonggung, in the room that father used for his hundokhaes, again, Han Mother presiding over a meeting where she had people go around and give their impressions of the mourning period. It must have been after, because it must have been after the actual Songhua. So it must have been a separate meeting. Yes, it was. Now that I think about it, where she went around, she named certain people, about how many people fit in that room, about 150 or so, and I was one of them again, and she had people go around and give their sort of impressions of the events. And people talked about how many congressmen had attended, people had come from overseas, how tens of thousands of people had gone through the line in an orderly fashion, and how tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. There were two locations, one at in the gymnasium down at the bottom of the hill, and then some at the top. So it must have been hundreds of thousands down at the bottom, because we had thousands of people coming through at the top of the hill. I was, of course, following Kukjinim around everywhere he went, because that was my job. And so when it was, and different members of the True Family would take turns greeting the mourners who came to view father's body in the actual palace. And so when Kukjin was on duty, I was there with him, and he would do several hours at a time up there, and then also several hours at a time down at the bottom of the hill, greeting mourners down there as well. And we had thousands of people going through daily at the top of the hill, and there were about 10 days or so, I guess. 10 or so days. It was, the whole mourning period was 13 days, but the actual number of days where people could view father's body at the top of the hill was about 10 days or so, I think, not the entire 13 days, because, there was a preparation period and stuff like that. And each day there were literally thousands of people. We had to limit the number of people who would come through because, well, for various reasons. So it was over that mourning period, tens of thousands of people were able to view father's body. So it must have been hundreds of thousands who came through the lines at the bottom of the hill to offer their respects in the gymnasium at the bottom of the hill. So it was logistically, it was quite an operation, because it's in the middle of the mountains, and there was only one road. So, and people were being bussed in, and of course other people were coming by cars. So to get those buses in and out was quite a logistic operation, and the people were lining up, and they were in line for hours. It was quite an operation. And so during this meeting, some of the leaders who were named by the Han Mother to speak pointed this out, how this logistic operation was carried out very successfully. And the flowers were incredibly beautiful. I don't know if you've seen photographs of that ceremony, but there was a professional flower sort of arranging company came in from Japan, and of course it cost a lot of money, but they brought, they came in with tens of thousands of flowers that were arranged in an incredibly beautiful manner, the most incredible flower arrangement or flower sort of presentation that I think I've ever seen. And I doubt very much that I'll ever see anything as beautiful like that in terms of flower arranging ever again. So that was, some people spoke about that. And, and also there were, of course, Songhai mourning events taking place around the world. And the second king traveled to Pyongyang during this mourning period, to accept the official mourning of the North Korean government and also father's relatives who were still alive at that time in North Korea. I believe they've passed away in the meantime. So that was also something, because the second king became one of the very, very few people in the world who, as civilians, not as government officials, but as civilians, traveled from Seoul to Pyongyang by land. That's an incredibly rare thing to happen. And the second king became one of the very few civilians to be allowed to do that. To do that, you have to have permission from the UN command on the south, and also the North Korean government and whatever their military command is on the north. Both sides have to agree, and both sides have to give permission for that to happen. And this was done for the second king specifically, and only on that occasion, for this civilian to travel that way. The general route for civilians to travel to Pyongyang is to go through Beijing, or sometimes through Vladivostok. Anyway, so that also happened, and that was a very impressive and historic thing to happen during the mourning period. So some people spoke about that. But then at the end, the Han Mother said, yeah, but, you guys missed the most important thing. And everybody's wondering, what is the most important thing? And she said, the most important thing is that my mother, who's in the spirit world, you understand, my mother built that gymnasium. She was speaking, of course, her mother, Daemonim. Hongsune is her name, and then Daemonim is the title that father gave her. Working through, what's her name? I forgot now. Kim Hyunam. How soon we forget. Kim Hyunam raised the money to and designed and built this gymnasium. And I remember the Han Mother saying, think what it would have been like if that gymnasium had not been built. We would have to have had this ceremony in some hotel someplace, maybe in the middle of Seoul or someplace, And sitting there, I was, kind of surprised, and I thought it odd. At this point, you understand, I was still loyal to the Han Mother. And I thought some things were strange, but I was definitely giving her the benefit of the doubt. But I thought it strange that she would focus on that kind of an external thing, as opposed to the tremendous outreach that had been done, especially the outreach that had been done to the congressmen and government officials in preparation for this, and the fruits of that outreach that had been demonstrated by their coming to this event. But anyway, this was her insistence that her mother, and of course she was wrong. It was not her mother. It was not Mrs. Hongsune, but all that was done by Father's blessing, and it was the power of Father's blessing that brought about the success of Cheongpyeong and the donations to Cheongpyeong. If Father had not blessed that, the Japanese members would not have donated. This was primarily a Japanese thing, okay, because Americans and Koreans, compared to the Japanese, donated a very minuscule amount to Cheongpyeong. I know the individuals have donated everything they can and everything they could, but compared to the Japanese, it's a minuscule amount. The Japanese would not have donated to Cheongpyeong unless it had had true Father's blessing. So it was not, the credit did not go to Mrs. Hong Sune or Demonim. But this was Han Mother's point at that time. So that was, I think you could say, the second salvo that I can remember of this coup d'etat that I was aware of. All right, that I was aware of. I mean, there were many things going on that I was not aware of. And the second king talks about how he and other members of the true family were called in and sort of asked, "Who do you think I am?" And the second king answered, "Oh, you're the victorious true mother," and so forth. And she said, "No, that I am God." And the second king was very astonished and said, "No, don't say that." This kind of thing. So these kinds of things were going on in the background that I and others, other sort of blessed central families, were completely unaware of. I was, maybe physically fairly close to Kukjinim at that time, but no matter how close you were, there were certain lines that were not crossed. So anyway, the second salvo that I was aware of, and then the third salvo I think that I was aware of was on, and the second king says he cannot confirm this, but my recollection is that he was dismissed as the head of the Korean church on September 30th, which also happened to be the Chuseok Day in Korea that year, in 2012. I can't remember how I heard about this, but on that day, and I was not present for this, but on that day, I understand the Han Mother gathered regional leaders from around the country and sort of senior members and to the Cheonjonggung Palace, and she instructed them to remove him as the head of the Korean church, and they did so. And I think that is where things really started to, where my loyalty to her really started to crumble. I would say that I could see that she was, by that time I think I was beginning to see that she was going on her own direction. And one of those two meetings that I mentioned already, she made the point that she was different from Father. And she made the point that Father was loving. Father related to you with love, but I'm not going to be like that. Something like that. So she already stated that she was going to be very different. And she started using this analogy that Father's words were like an unpolished diamond and she was going to polish them. Those kinds of statements were coming out then. And I didn't really understand what she meant by that at that time, but obviously now she meant that she was going to edit them and to change them to her liking. She had already, as we know, as we didn't know then, but know now, she had already, in the months before that, gone down to Songhwasa and forced them to republish some of the later volumes that contained Father's words that were critical of her and of Korean leaders who were under her wing, so to speak. She had Songhwa, the publishing company, the church's publishing company, which had already sent out all these volumes, recall the ones that had the offending passages, recall them all, and republish them after censoring these passages that she did not approve of. This was done even while Father was still in his physical body. So that was what it turns out she meant by polishing the diamond, or cutting the diamond, or whatever whatever the correct expression is. And then in October, I think she was talking more and more about taking direct control over certain organizations. And then I had my meeting with her on November 15th, which I've talked about already a number of times previously. And then at the end of the year, very end of the year, around maybe December 30 or 31 or somewhere around there was a Songhwa ceremony in Japan for Mr. Kajikuri, who had been the president of the Japanese church during the time that Kukjinim was helping Japan go up against the kidnapping issue, and also the government. Basically, the government was about to kind of really come down hard on the church, and so Kukjinim was there helping to reform the church there, so that the government would not come down and not starting arresting people, not start arresting or not actually closing the church. Mr. Kajikuri was head of the church during that time, and he was always ill, and he was ill when he took the job. He was terminally ill when he took the job. It was always a question of how long he could actually serve in that position. And at one point, Mr. Kajikuri actually said to Kukjinim, I'm basically, in a Japanese indirect way, told Kukjinim, I'm about to die, please appoint my successor. But he didn't die, and he continued much longer than anyone, his doctors or himself or anyone expected. But then in December of 2012, towards the end of 2012, he passed away, and his Songhwa ceremony was held probably the 30th or 31st of December at the headquarters church in Japan. And Kukjinim attended and gave what basically turned out to be his farewell speech. And Kukjinim had a sense of what the Han Mother was up to. After he returned to Korea, the Han Mother gave instruction that he should no longer go to Japan, that she said, I will handle Japan directly. As she had been saying, I will handle this directly, I will handle this directly, I will handle this directly. So she was sort of gathering all power, centralizing all power in herself. And in early January, she announced that, or not announced, but she gave instruction that Kukjinim was no longer to go to Japan. And apparently, now that I think about it, Kukjinim realized that this was coming, and so when he spoke at that Songhwa ceremony, he gave basically what was his farewell address to the Japanese members. And he said that the Japanese church needed to become a church that served the needs of its members, that a church that, first of all, found out what those needs were, and then fulfilled those needs, served those needs, and a church that reduced the donation burden of members. I think he may have given us a figure, some reduce it by 10% a year or 20% a year, something like that. I'm not sure about that. I have to go back and look at those remarks that he gave. But anyway, he was, and he said that Father had said, he communicated that Father had said that the indemnity that must be paid by the Japanese was over. That was over. And that the Japanese were freed from this. He gave that statement during that address, as I recall. But anyway, he was relieved of that responsibility as soon as he returned to Korea, a responsibility towards Japan. And things got, stranger and stranger. So in January, I stopped donating to the Family Federation. I was still working for the Tongyo Foundation at that time, and Kukjinim still was as well. And I was still his full-time translator. But then in the beginning of March, Kukjinim came to America And he had been coming to America on a regular basis during the time that he was working in Korea, because he still had his business here. And this was the agreement that he had with Father, that he would work for Father in Korea. But Father would be okay with him coming back to America, from time to time to continue to run his company here, the Salo and the Car Arms company here. And so he returned. He left Korea and returned to the U.S. Sometime at the beginning of March, as I recall, on what I and others on the staff, I guess, assumed was just another one of those trips. But that turned out to be his. Well, he never returned to Korea after that. On March 23rd, I think, during the March, then there was, after he left, immediately after he left, there was a move initiated to remove him as the chairman of the board of the Tongil Foundation. Now, according to the bylaws of the Tongil Foundation, meetings of the board could be called by the chairman, and it was up to the chairman to determine the time and place of these meetings. There were seven members of the board, and a majority of those members could get together and demand that the chairman call a meeting. That was their right. If they could get four people together out of the seven, they could demand that a meeting be called. But according to the bylaws, it was still the chairman's prerogative to decide the time and place of such a meeting. So in March, four members of the board made such a demand. And obviously, and I think in the beginning it was not made clear, but later on they did make it clear that the purpose of this meeting was to vote to remove the chairman. So under the bylaws, it was Kuk Jinim's duty to call this meeting for his removal. But it was his prerogative to determine when and where this meeting would be held, within a certain period, I think. And so he called the meeting. He called the meeting in, near the Car Arms headquarters in New York at a certain time, on a Saturday. I believe it was March 23rd. And the four people said, no, we're going to have this. We want this meeting to happen in the Cheonjong Palace. And they were apparently under instruction from Han Mother to have this meeting in the palace under her watchful eye, because she wanted to make sure that they did what that she wanted them to. And but Kuk Jinim did not budge. So on March 23rd, a strange thing happened. The four rebels, the four betrayers, went to the Cheonjong Palace, and three loyal members of the board came to America and gathered at a hotel near the Car Arms head office. And obviously, the one over here, the three people did not have a quorum. Okay, so but the four people, they had a quorum, they had a majority there, but it was a meeting that had not been called by the chairman, so it was a meeting that was not legal by the bylaws. But they went ahead and voted, passed a resolution on their part to remove the chairman. And then on Monday, I think, they went down to the government office that records these things and recorded that resolution. Now, So it was an illegal meeting by which they voted to remove Kuk Chinim. Now, Kuk Chinim got his title from True Father, and he was chairman of the Tongil Foundation not because he had been voted in, not by the authority of the board, but he was the chairman of the Tongil Foundation by authority of True Father, and True Father never removed him, and so. Under heavenly law, Kuk Chinim is still, to this day, chairman of the Tongil Foundation, the legitimate chairman of the Tongil Foundation. And the people who are running the Tongil Foundation today are usurpers under heavenly law, I'm just saying. Under Korean law, under secular law, yes. Even though that meeting was illegal, still it was registered, and the government office accepted the registration. I mean, 4 out of 7 people voted to remove the chairman. So, and the government, the explanation that the lawyers gave us at that time, the government office does not go into the details of the bylaws and so forth to determine whether or not this meeting was legal, and if Kuk Chinim wanted to challenge that, he would have to hire his own lawyers and go up against the Tongil Foundation to recover his position under secular law, and which he chose not to do. So anyway, that happened in March, and so Kuk Chinim was removed by under secular law. At least he was removed as chairman of the Tongil Foundation, and Pak No-hee, the younger brother of Bo-hee Pak, Pak No-hee was put in that position in his place. But he was a usurper, and the 4 people were usurpers who voted that. So today, guess who is chairman of the Tongil Foundation? I believe it's Kim Sok-byung. I think Choi Yoon-gi had a stint, had a term for a time, I think, but I think now it's the original usurper, Kim Sok-byung, I think now is in that position, the head of what used to be eyepiece TV. So this sort of the leader of the coup d'etat now is in that position. I believe that's correct. I haven't really been following the comings and goings of the leadership changings in Family Federation too closely, but I think that's what's going on today. So these usurpers are in charge of that, and they are, of course, the same can be said with the second king. Father put him in charge of the Korean church, and Father never removed him. So again, the current leaders of the Korean church are usurpers, and of course, the second king fired them all anyway in 2015, February, I believe, beginning when he fired a lot of people in one of his sermons then. So anyway, that is my thoughts on the parable of the vineyard, where the husbandmen were actually, in this case, in the parable, actually kill the heir to make the inheritance theirs. So they have chased out the heir and to make the inheritance theirs. And we shall see. Yeah. So what happens here? What shall therefore the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandman, and will give the vineyard unto others.